Okay, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. First, my name is Jamie Perry, and I am co-organizing this session with Sebastian, who is also here. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the AOM Conflict Management Division session on teaching innovations in negotiation and conflict management workshop. So today we're going to be learning new teaching exercises in simulations. Our session will be from 11 a.m. Eastern Time to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. After our session concludes at 12:30 p.m., please stay and join us for a social event afterwards where we'll be mixing and mingling, discussing and the teaching innovations we learned and even sharing new ideas, catching up, and new projects. So today we're going to hear from each presenter on their specific topic area. As mentioned earlier in our email, we'll be talking about New Recruit Online Simulation, K Corp, veteran NFL player, Lovely Braids, Motorworks, and Oceanwide Shipping. And right now, I'm going to move it over and give it to Cindy Wang, who is going to be organizing the session portion of this workshop. She is the executive director of the DRRC and clinical professor at Northwestern University. Thank you so much for joining us, and now I will hand it over to Cindy.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, great. Thank you so much for joining. I saw Miranda actually had a question about whether people could get a certificate if they needed to after we're attending the session. So if you do, please email us at drrc@kellogg.northwestern.edu. We can make sure that you do get a certificate for completing this. All right, so thank you so much for coming. Happy New Year, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about New Recruit. A lot of you might have negotiated that in the past. This is a negotiation that was written by Maggie Neal. I think Maggie is here, so thank you so much for joining. What this is a little different take on New Recruit. It's actually done in a chat format. So what I'm going to do is start by talking a little bit about the main teaching points. A lot of them remain the same. There are some new teaching points based on this format of the simulation. But it is a two-party negotiation. One player plays the recruiter, the other plays the candidate. Now, the candidate has already received a job offer, and what this is a negotiation regarding the details of the deal. So in this particular negotiation, what's classic about this is it's one of the first negotiations to really introduce integrative potential into a negotiation. So this involves 8 issues. And there is an opportunity for pie expansion by capitalizing on the differences between the parties' preferences. So regardless of whether there is this ability to enlarge the pie, there's always still a distributive component. So I always talk about this type of negotiation in terms of a metaphor of a pie. You can always expand the pie, but you always have to chop up the pie and give certain people a bigger slice of the pie. Another thing that this negotiation does is you have to start thinking about a future relationship. A recruiter and a candidate will probably see each other over several years, so you want to make sure that when you're negotiating in a positive manner. Now, what's different in this particular negotiation is that over the last decade or so, I've always taught New Recruit in terms of giving each party a roll of a PDF. And they read it and they negotiate in front of each other. But in this particular simulation, it actually takes place via chat platform, which is great for providing more insight into the actual negotiation process. You can actually see what people are doing, how they're anchoring. You can actually see the types of questions they're asking. So there's several lessons with New Recruit. The first one is scoring systems. Horia is going to get into this a little bit more about how to develop a scoring system. But with New Recruit, what you see is that there's actually a built-in scoring system already. Each issue has points assigned to them. And what you're going to see is that on the sheet is that some issues are more important than others. They have more points assigned to them. And you have to really take this into account when you're negotiating. This allows students to really understand how to quantify qualitative issues that they may underweight otherwise. So another lesson that this negotiation does is allows students to understand how to categorize different issues. The main ones students really focus on are those distributive issues, those that are zero sum, in which one person's gain is another person's loss. Beyond that, though, students start to recognize other issues, including the compatible issues. So for example, here, students, both students, the recruiter and the candidate, want to be in San Francisco. But alas, you always get 2 or 3 pairs of students that end up in Atlanta, even though both parties actually want to be in San Francisco. The last thing is to recognize those integrative trade-offs, those blends between the conflicting and corresponding interests, and understand how to log roll, namely how to maximize the overall value by trading off issues that are less important for those that are more important. So what you see here is the main goal in this negotiation, after understanding what those issues are, is to seek out that win-win. If you're able to understand the compatible issues, if you're able to trade off those integrative issues, then you're going to reach that Pareto optimal frontier. And within that Pareto optimal frontier, what you'll see is people have a maximum joint gain of 13,200. And those are the students that, we really point out during the debrief. So what you can see here is that how the chat function works a little bit. So in this particular case, we have 2 negotiators, Barun and Taylor, and they're starting to really gauge each other's priorities. They're asking those great questions of what areas are important to you. Can you tell me a little bit more about the factors that matter most to you? What's nice about this chat functions is you can actually see this. Usually they're in their rooms and you don't know what they're really doing, but here you can actually see exactly what's going on. So that brings us to kind of the last lesson of this negotiation, which is that I use this actually to teach how to negotiate in a virtual world. Of course, in the last couple of years, this is very, very relevant. My assumption is that it's going to continue to be extremely relevant. And it is very difficult to negotiate in a virtual world as compared to face-to-face. You can't see people's expressions as easily. You can't really hear the tone in their voice. So by negotiating this in a chat format, my students have really enjoyed it because they really understand, hey, what additional things that do I need to do in order to make sure the other side understands where I'm coming from. So what I see in this particular negotiation is that people actually, find it more difficult to gauge those compatible interests. Going back to the San Francisco example, you can see if people start misrepresenting their priorities, they're going to end up in Atlanta, and that's what happened to poor Santosh and Prabhash. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Renzo. Renzo is the one that has developed this platform. He runs the company SimCase, and it's just an amazing platform. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about it.
Perfect. Thank you, Cindy. So what I want to share now is sort of a little bit more about the benefits of having gone virtual, and to give you guys a glimpse into what the experience looks like for an instructor and for students, since going virtual 2 years ago might have been a little challenging. This year, a little bit less so. I think everyone's comfortable with it. But the idea is that with negotiations exercises, going virtual allows you to, and Cindy, I'll ask you to click, it allows you to reduce the prep, right? So we work with based off cases that are popular, and it automatically sort of tabulates outcomes. So not only does the benefit of virtual come through in terms of the visibility into the chat, but for new recruits specifically, people were building very large sort of tables to lay out all of the different positions on issues, and this all happens within the system automatically. The other side is this visibility. So Cindy, if you can click again. You're able to track every offer and every dyad. So it's no longer sort of hunting and pecking to see, which students might have had interesting outcomes and have interesting lessons to tell. You're able to sort of identify that more easily using this digital platform. And as I mentioned, check out those chat transcripts. So on the next slide, Cindy. In terms of logistics, these are available not only through Northwestern's and Northwestern Kellogg's DRC platform, but also they've recently been published on the Harvard Business Publishing website. And what that means is that there are multiple ways for students to access this. It's really depending on what you're currently doing and what you feel more comfortable with. Through the DRC, students will access the exercise via their email, whereas Harvard Business Publishing allows students to access it via the HPP platform if you already have an account, or they have a Canvas integration that works well. So in terms of student experience, and if you can click one more time, this will begin to run. We'll welcome the students. And yeah, perfect. You can click on that play button on the left there. All right, perfect. And well, actually, this is the next slide. Cindy, if you want to, I can, if you can transfer the screen, I can screen share. Perfect. Sorry about the technical difficulties. But the idea is we welcome the students to the platform. They'll be able to see the person who they're negotiating with. And then we're having an issue with this. So what we can do, Cindy, is we'll follow up with this particular video. And let's see if this one will run. Yeah, okay, so we'll follow up, but essentially the student experience, it's a chat that you may be familiar with if you use Messenger or WhatsApp. And within the platform, the students will be able to actually create an offer. And what it does is it actually pulls that role's specific points so that they can more easily sort of gauge what the value will be of each position. And they'll be able to trade offers. And if in the worst case, they do want to abandon negotiation, they have that option here as well. For the instructor, this is the automated leaderboard. This is modeled off some of the whiteboards that we were seeing instructors put together for New Recruit. They're able to sort these leaderboards, and we've highlighted some of the interesting outcomes in either red or green. They can then essentially use this as if they were using a PowerPoint slide deck and just simply click through some of the interesting lessons that come from the exercise, the issue types, and here in the Pareto Frontier. And then the additional functionality that we find instructors like is the ability to actually dig into a specific dyad's negotiation, see how their offers evolved over time, and the chat history. Finally, this is sort of a project that we've worked on with the DRC that's kind of created a package of different simulations that build up to New Recruit. New Recruit can be one of the more sort of advanced titles available. So it starts with energetics, you can build up to Strummer, then Zephyr, and finally New Recruit. And the idea is to sort of have students introduce them to zone of possible agreements, distributive issues, then in Strummer, introduce integrative issues. With Zephyr, introduce a scenario where the zone of possible agreement is negative, and finally handle all of these teaching points through New Recruit. So that's sort of the idea there. And I will hand the screen back over to you.
All right. I see that there are a couple questions in chat, so maybe we'll just go through one or two of them. There's a back and forth about the chat function versus video or even face-to-face. Is it realistic? I think one thing that to consider is the idea that at least portions of job negotiations are actually done via email, asynchronously, or even reflecting this type of format where you really can't see the other person's expressions. A lot of my students did talk about why they like this, because they better understand how you have to negotiate differently when you don't have that ability to see each other face to face. I think Stephen, you might have run this before, but you can also use this platform if you prefer a face-to-face type format to actually negotiate more face-to-face, but use the platform because the debrief is the organization of the debrief is really nice for the students. All right, are there any other questions? All right, how long does this typically take? So in general, I give the face-to-face students about 30 minutes to negotiate new recruit. Once again, reflecting the virtual world, it takes a little bit longer. So I tend to give students about 45 minutes start to finish in a class to negotiate this. All right, thanks for the questions. I'm gonna just hand it over to Horia because I wanna make sure that everybody has enough time to negotiate, and then we can always come back to these questions at the very end. All right, so Horia is gonna talk about K-Corp. She's an assistant professor at Santa Clara University. In this particular exercise, she's gonna tell you a little bit about how to create a custom scoring system that actually reflects the student's own personal preferences.
Thanks, Cindy, and thanks so much for everyone attending this morning or this afternoon or wherever you are around the world, and to the Conflict Management and AOM and DRC for putting this on. It's a great way to get us kicked off for the new year. My co-authors, Cindy, Laura, and Miguel. Just a little bit about what I'll be covering in my brief time with you. I'll tell you a little bit about the teaching points, logistics, how I debrief this exercise, some of the frequently asked questions, and then let you know how we've been doing this virtually, and then a little bit of student feedback and hopefully time for questions. So in terms of the main teaching points for K-Corp, the big sell with this exercise is that students are walked through pretty systematically how to set up their own sort of weighted personal scoring system. So it really invites students to identify what are their preferences and priorities rather than taking on a role for this exercise. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. This exercise is also designed to help students think about things beyond typical compensation issues. So we do have salary and bonus. However, we have additional issues that relate to work family and role issues. And then finally, we are inviting students to think about their role of gender, their own, their partners, and how that might be influencing each person's scoring system and their general approach to the negotiation. So in terms of the logistics here, it's a two-party integrative negotiation. It's between a current top performing employee and their manager following a favorable annual review. This was based on a sort of real world case exercise situation that we adopted for this exercise. It takes about 30 minutes to negotiate. There are 6 issues, 5 possible outcomes per issue. As I mentioned, we have the traditional compensation issues such as bonus and salary. We have work family issues, so flexible work arrangements, which are quite popular these days, obviously, and vacation time, and then role issues. So the employee would like to take on more management responsibility and take on some case work that has greater visibility. So K-Corp has both a high and low reservation price version. So the low reservation price version is 50 points, and we've looked at that quite extensively. I'll tell you a little bit about the data. And then we have a high reservation point version, which is 70 points. In terms of student prep, it takes about 25 to 35 minutes. We've done this both in person in the moment. So we've looked at K-Corp quite extensively in the lab with MBAs, and in the lab, we have them do their prep sort of right there in the moment. In the classroom, we've assigned this oftentimes as an out of class exercise where they're prepping, and it tends to take 25 to 35 minutes from what they tell me. The students receive 2 pages of role information, and then step-by-step instructions and a short video tutorial about 6 or 7 minutes that guides them through developing their own personal scoring system. And we give them an Excel template where they're able to input their different values. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. And as Cindy mentioned, K-Corp can be nicely sequenced after other exercises where they're already familiar with built-in scoring systems, such as New Recruit or CARS. It's not required. So we do have data with students where they have absolutely no negotiation experience or no experience with scoring systems, and the exercise still runs really well. So in terms of the scoring system, we tell students that when you're developing a scoring system that you want to determine the issues and determine the possible outcomes. In K-Corp, we obviously do this for the students already. So as I mentioned, the 6 issues and 5 outcomes per issue. So the first step that the students really doing in their Excel template is ranking from 1 to 5 their preferences for each of those outcomes for the 6 issues. They are then assigning points for each of those outcomes and weights for each of the 6 issues. And this then creates what we call their sort of weighted personal point sheet. So in their Excel, it tabulates sort of what does that student value in terms of points. It's really quantifying for each of the outcomes across the 6 issues. And so when they walk into their negotiation, whether that's in person or online, they have this nice weighted point sheet where they can really identify as they're negotiating sort of what does it take for them to reach their reservation price. So again, 50 in the low version, 70 in the high version. In the Excel template that the students receive, they also have an option to compare packages. So in the sheet, they can just put in different scenarios that could come up in the negotiation, and it will quickly just automatically tabulate sort of their points so they can think through these things in advance. And I would say about 20% of students actually use this optional sheet, but the ones that do use it say that it's really helpful to walk through it in that way. As I mentioned, we have a brief, looks like it's 5 minutes and 42 seconds tutorial for students to walk through the scoring sheet, and that's been really helpful as well. In terms of the debrief, we've spent quite a bit of time putting together some nice materials for the instructors. So there's an Excel sheet for the instructor to just input the student results, and it will automatically generate graphs. So then you can just put that into your presentation when debriefing with students. We have a quite detailed teaching note as well as a slide deck with discussion questions and things like that. And then I also put in on the slide deck some preliminary data. So as I mentioned, we've looked at this fairly extensively, both in the lab, in the classroom, and online. So with undergraduate students, with master's students who have no background in business, so they are masters in information systems, and then our traditional MBA students. And so that data is in the slide deck for instructors, in case you're interested or in case your students are interested in terms of what does this look like in other classrooms. Some questions that you might be asking yourself or thinking about right now. So do students need to have experience with the scoring system? No, as I mentioned, we've looked at this with students who have never negotiated before, with students who have never used scoring systems before, but have negotiation experience, and then with well-seasoned MBAs who have experience with scoring systems and negotiations, and it's worked out really well. How do I ensure that students actually complete the scoring system beforehand? Obviously, when it's in the lab, they're doing it. When it's an assignment, sort of as a deliverable in a classroom, that has worked out really well. So we've asked students just to upload their Excel sheet before they come to class. And that way it creates a little bit of accountability that they will actually do it. What if students have questions about the scoring system? So they can email me, and it's not because I love receiving email, it's because I have great confidence in the detailed instructions in the tutorial that it'll be crystal clear to the students. So I've put this offer out there for students to email me if they have questions, and I have yet to receive an email, but I still will put that offer out there. So if your students have questions, they can send me an email. And then finally, you might be wondering, how does this work online? What needs to be modified? Basically, I use a random number generator to assign the dyads, and then, as usual, upload that CSV file to Zoom for the breakout rooms. They can get their role materials from the DRC emailed to them in advance, and everything just flows really well that way. So very little modifications required in order to go online. And similar to the classroom online, I'll rotate through the breakout rooms and things like that, just to see how students are doing. So again, virtually, we've been trying this online since the fall. So we've looked at this with 42 master's students, 22 undergrads, and then continuing data collection. So far, we're not making really any modifications to the exercise with it being online. As I mentioned, we started in September this YouTube tutorial for the scoring system. Students seem to like that. And finally, I'll say, the role information has a sheet where they can input their values from the exercise. And what I've done more recently is just move that to Qualtrics, and I can share that with anyone who's interested in using the exercise. And obviously that saves paper and it's good for all of us. I just wanted to show you a little bit of the feedback, sort of types of things students have said about this exercise. So these are some of the undergraduate students, and really a lot of people have said that they found it to be helpful and using the scoring system, not only for this exercise, but planning to use it in the future as well. Some of our master's students, so again, these were master's students in information systems, so they don't have a background in business, they've never taken a negotiation class. And so it was more of an entry for them, and they still seem to appreciate that they're thinking about their own priorities with regards to these issues and outcomes. And then our sort of well-seasoned Kellogg MBAs felt like it was quite realistic in terms of something that they would encounter in a real life setting. And it helped them sort of think about how the importance of being prepared, so that they did this work again in the lab, sort of before the negotiation, or in the classroom. About 25 minutes was how much the MBAs took in the classroom. Or as I mentioned, it can be as a deliverable. So I think I'm at time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Corey, there's some questions in the chat. So one of the questions is, will K-Corp be an IDG exercise? Yes, we'll talk to Niraj and we will make sure that it is put on IDG. And then if you can speak to the second question, Horia, it's about how you approach the debrief.
So it will vary from dyad to dyad, because some people are using sort of mini packages. Some people are going issue by issue. Again, it's a little bit different because we are inviting students to really show up how they naturally normally would in a negotiation rather than taking on a role. So I think the second negotiation, or the second debrief question, because the first one's just asking if anyone reached an impasse. And I'll say that out of hundreds of dyads that we've ran this on the 50 reservation price, I think only 2 have reached an impasse. So that's the first debrief question. But the second debrief question is, how did you sort of go about these issues? Who started the negotiation in terms of the employee or the manager? And then sort of tell me about how you, most of the time students are starting with sort of the monetary compensation issues, so starting with salary and bonus, but it's getting them to sort of think about, why is that the case, and is that truly what my preference is, and things like that. So I think I'm out of time, but again, you can email me and I'm happy, or you can actually tweet me as well, so I'll respond in 280 characters or less. So thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to veteran NFL player. So in this case, exercise, Tracy Dumas, who's an associate professor at the Ohio State University, and Jeffrey Diamond, who's a retired NFL executive. They wrote an exercise based on a real life case of a US professional football player negotiating his contract. So I will hand it over to Tracy and Jeffrey.
Okay, thanks a lot. And for some reason, there we go. Sharing my screen with you all. So as she noted, this is based on a player's agent negotiating with an NFL executive. It's based on one of Jeff's actual negotiations. So since he's here, I believe he's here on the call, I'll let him talk to you a little bit about the context and then I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the teaching aspects. So
Tracy, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think we can hear
Okay,
you.
good, because I'm not sure my video is working, but
Okay.
hello to everybody and thank you for having us today.
I think there's some feedback
Oh,
going on.
you've got some feedback. Are you on 2 devices maybe? Uh-oh. All right. Well, I'm not sure what happened. I'll go ahead and talk just
Okay,
about
can
the,
you hear me now, Tracy?
oh yeah, that's good. And I
Okay.
don't hear feedback.
Okay, good. Well, I'll introduce myself. As Tracy said, I'm Jeff Diamond, and I'm the former Vice President General Manager of the Minnesota Vikings, and I was President of the Tennessee Titans. I now work for an NFL agent group out of Minneapolis and do media work and speaking in college classes on negotiation, labor relations, strategic management, sports business. And I've spoken in Tracy's Ohio State MBA classes for the past several years and have always enjoyed speaking in her classes and all the other classes I speak at around the country on these subjects. And so we started discussing this idea of doing this NFL veteran player exercise case study, which has been exciting to work on. And I think it's a great real life case that I personally negotiated early in my general manager career with the Vikings with an all-pro player. And the player specifically was Chris Dolman, who is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I negotiated with his agent. In the exercise, we do not identify Chris Dolman specifically, although in the teaching notes, we say that you certainly can bring it up at the end of the exercise, but we don't identify him. We identify him as a player named Anderson. And I think so that students can't look it up online or try to identify it, although we did change the dynamics of the negotiation from back in the 90s to more current in terms of dollar amounts, especially, which is important. And so Chris Dolman was basically coming off his rookie contract, a 5-year contract. He was a premier player, one of the best players in the NFL at his position on the defensive line. And I negotiated a long-term deal with his agent. And then there was a huge spike in the NFL revenues and the salary cap 2 years after he signed this 5-year deal. And my policy was that I'm not going to renegotiate a contract 2 years into the deal. And what happened was another player, Reggie White specifically in this case, but we identify him as a different name. He signed as a free agent with the Green Bay Packers for more than double the salary that Chris Dolman had. And so this is 2 years into a 5-year deal. And basically, the first part of the negotiation is the initial 5-year contract that we negotiated, which was an excellent contract. Everybody was happy with it, and he was well compensated for his talent level. But then 2 years into that 5-year deal, he wanted a renegotiation, which was really not within the realm of possibility, or I would have every player on my team lined up to do a renegotiation. Although I was willing to perhaps give him some very difficult to reach incentives and trying to get him to go one more year on the deal. And then I would do an extension from that point. So I think it's a great real life negotiation. I think it's really a fascinating study of what happens in a situation like this, where you think a contract that you negotiated was a good deal at the time. And then as it turns out, a couple of years later, it doesn't pan out that way. And then in the final analysis, as we talk about it in our epilogue, we did have to trade Chris Dolman to another team. And so, and that's part 2 of the negotiation is how do you handle this renegotiation? So that's, I'm really excited to work on this project with Tracy and with all of you. And so I'll throw it back to you, Tracy.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. All right. So as he pointed out, this is a 2-round negotiation. And one of the reasons that I developed this is because I was looking for something that I might be able to exchange with ABC Local 190, those of you who've been around for a long time. So one of the main issues is that I wanted another case where people could renegotiate with the same party on these issues. This case is pretty, there's a lot, it's intense. So I think it's best run after there's been prior introduction to integrative concepts, things like log rolling and package deals. The first round in particular if you're preparing in class, but I do assign it to students before so that they have at least a week to prepare. But if you're gonna have them reading it in class, they're gonna need at least 45 minutes to read through the first round. Round two, the renegotiation is a little bit shorter preparation, so about 20 minutes. I have done it in an MBA class and I have put the students in teams, so in pairs on each side. So it is 2 parties, but I would say consider team on team depending on your students and your learning goals. And of course, additional time to prepare if they are coordinating in pairs and negotiating team on team. The first round is about 55 to 75 minutes. I can tell you students get really engaged in this case and trying to find trade-offs between things like a signing bonus and base salary and all of those issues. Round two is a shorter set of issues, but they still do spend a good deal of time discussing whether they're even going to allow the player to renegotiate, whether he's going to be traded, whether they're willing to delay a year. So even though the case itself is much shorter, they still spend a good deal of time negotiating. I typically allow them a completely different class session and negotiation in between. And that's really just an artifact of the way I used to run ABC Local 190. But also what I tend to like to do, because this case does not have a scoring system built in, this is also another situation where you can use it to allow students to develop a scoring system. So for me, also allowing time in between gives me some time to give them some feedback on their planning or whatever they submitted if I assign them a scoring system. And similar to what I used to do with ABC Local 190, I don't debrief anything at all until they have completed round two. So they don't know they don't get any detail about this until after round two. When I'm debriefing, I generally start off by prompting student reflection. And in particular, because I chose this case because I like the dynamics of renegotiating, I usually start off asking them about the effect of round one on round two, the relationship, how they felt about round one, how that might be affecting the negotiation, but then also things like opportunities, like you have an opportunity to refer to, all right, I gave you a concession last time around, so you can be a little bit more helpful. So I also point to the strategic impact of having multiple rounds. This case has a lot of different issues going on that you can draw into the debrief. So you can spend the whole time discussing the dynamics of a multi-part negotiation, but then also we do have a player's agent here. And the way the case is written with the true motives of the agent. So the agent really did have a motive to get this player traded to a bigger market so that he could get better endorsement deals, which meant more money for the agent. But the player himself actually preferred to get the contract done and get a long-term contract done with the team. So there was a little bit of, kind of principal agent issue here. So that's also a learning point that you can use in this case. And then we usually talk through all of those issues. So I asked them about that. What did that feel like? Did you experience that tension? How did you structure your deal? How did you identify opportunities for trade-offs? And again, applicable concepts, all of the integrative concepts that have been addressed before: repeated long-term negotiation, attempt to renegotiate. Something like this, a player's contract, you can discuss contingent contracts, the use of agents, and the development of scoring systems. So all of those are applicable here. And these are some of the sources that I draw on and that I assign to the students in working on this case and developing this case. As I said, something like the new recruit is good for them to have done before they've done this case, because then they're familiar with the kind of mechanisms and tactics associated with multiple issues. In the teaching notes, as Jeff said, we do include an epilogue. So at the end, if students want to find out, okay, what did the real people do after round two? They couldn't reach a deal. So we do let them know that he ended up being traded. But then, and these are just some examples of the way that I present the results. I usually get them talking a little bit before I post the results. And just so you know, we have changed these numbers. So these numbers are low relative to what are in the case currently, but these are examples of what groups came up with. Most groups reach a deal the first time around. If they don't, in the round 2 materials, we do say, if you didn't reach a deal, here's your deal from last time, and you're negotiating based on that. And part of the reason that's important is one of the reasons the player wants to renegotiate is this new player got a deal that's more than double the value of his deal. So that's why it's important to have some kind of baseline in the case. So again, if they didn't negotiate in round 1, we give them information. And then this is an example of what happened in round 2. And so that's it. That's our case. Question.
Thank you so much, Tracy. We have a couple of questions from the chat. The first question is from Erica Hall. She asks if you are familiar with the Bullard houses. Also, agents, would this go before or after that?
Great question. So I am familiar with Bullard houses, and I did use them both last semester. I used Bullard after this case in this particular instance, but it could go before as well. It just kind of depends on what your emphasis is. So when I do Bullard, my emphasis is heavily on ethics in the debrief, so I don't spend as much time talking about agents. So I primarily discussed agents with respect to the NFL contract case, but then also I use virtual Victorian, and so I talk about agents with that as well. So I did it afterwards, but I don't see any reason why I couldn't go before as well. Just depends on your emphasis in your debrief.
Are there any more questions for Tracy? Are you saying something, Jen?
Oh, so someone said, Erica said, is this on IDG? This case is brand spanking new in terms of with the DRRC, but I guess, Cindy, they'll send it because I do use IDG. I use that, and especially now in this virtual environment, I lean on it even more heavily. So I use it, and I'm guessing that they're going to put it on there.
Yes, we will definitely have many discussions with Niraj after this. Thanks. All right, we're gonna move on. So we're gonna head on to Lovely Braids. In this particular negotiation, it involves 3 to 4 parties in which there's a high-powered third party intervenes in a dispute between 2 parties. So Stephen is going to present this. Stephen Humphrey from the Pennsylvania State University. He's a professor of management there, and Emily Heafy from the University of Massachusetts Amherst will also be talking a little bit about how we apply this negotiation to diversity and inclusion efforts.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to talk with y'all. Hopefully everything comes through all cleanly for you in this kind of context. As Cynthia was sort of setting up for us, this is an interesting negotiations. We're moving from dyadic to multi-party. Is also a fun thing is that, let the community add to this and grow this. When this was originally created, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we had a somewhat narrow focus is what we were trying to accomplish originally. Through feedback and development from other faculty, this has now grown, and its teaching points have actually gotten larger. And Emily will jump in later and part of the way through this presentation to talk about some of the additional value that we have here. But anyway, as Cynthia noted, this is a 3 or 4 person negotiation, depending on how people approach this. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It deals with 3 levels of employees within an entrepreneurial context. You have a frontline employee, the person who's doing sort of the work. You have a first line manager, and then you have a supervisor above them. So it introduces some really interesting dynamics that you wouldn't have in just a traditional dyadic negotiation. And ultimately, this comes down to how do we deal with the dispute between a manager and an employee? So a truly traditional kind of an issue of not a formal contract negotiation, but rather an informal dispute that we need to do and resolve in this kind of a context. Who are our 4 players? We have Jordan, who is a part-time hair salon employee, who's a star employee, but regularly sort of flaunts the rules, and that has consequences for the context. Zeke is the manager, is new to the job and wants to prove himself as capable, so that has sort of dynamics of both trying to resolve the dispute, but also demonstrate one's worth. Above that, we have Sydney, who's a director of operations for 15 different salons within this organization, so has some real insight to what the organizational goals are, has been asked to sit in on the dispute because Zeke and Jordan haven't sort of completely resolved it. And then, as I said, we have a 4th role here, which is Terry, who's another first-line employee who has a sort of a balancing issue that comes in here. Balance in terms of how you administration. Those of you who have been teaching negotiation for a while know that things aren't easily divisible by certain numbers. This gives us flexibility to go, instead of, if it's not divisible by 3, we can go to 4, from time to time. But it also introduces an interesting power dynamics as well. You had a coalitional opportunity for Jordan that you didn't have otherwise. All right, so why should we care about this? Why should we use a simulation? I'm going to give you 3 different reasons for it. Though, as I said, these things are emerging, so we may have more as we go along. The first one, and this is the original goal of this negotiation, was very much as a third-party intervention kind of context. We wanted to talk about this idea of what happens when we bring in somebody else to manage the dispute, as opposed to a contractual third party. Those of you who have taught that before, oftentimes that's dealt with from the law school, the ones who do that. This is more of an emergent one. So we have an opportunity for a supervisor to step in and say, how can we manage this? And we provide 2 different flavors of that. One is a taking charge and the other is the unbiased. In the taking charge, Sydney's role, which again is this director of operations, is encouraged to sort of demonstrate how to do this to Zeke by running the meeting and controlling the situation. On the other side, if you're given the unbiased, it's Sydney's encouraged to sort of sit back and allow this to move forward, see what Jordan and Zeke want to resolve and how they want to resolve it. So it's a less forceful kind of a perception. So it gives you nice little opportunities there. The second piece with this is to go with management and entrepreneurial context. At Penn State, our negotiation classes are staffed with about 80% of the students are actually entrepreneurship majors or minors. Actually, those are now majors. I actually stopped the minors from actually getting into it because it's such a high demand. And as a function of that gives really interesting learning opportunities for them on how do we deal with negotiation in an entrepreneurial context. So in this situation, this is not negotiation when you have a 30,000 employee company. This is where you've got 100 people, and in negotiation with a single employee has a big impact for the organization, the bottom line, and then particularly for the organizational policies. They're still early on in this organization, which means there's not formal routines or policies that are here. And so part of what you're negotiating on is what are going to be the standards of practice for this organization. Which, again, that's why adding in the Terry role becomes really kind of interesting, because the person cares about what this is going to mean for them, even though the dispute is not directly involving that person. So again, it gets some really interesting opportunities for this balance here. And then again, each party has a little bit of a different insight as to what's going on in the organization. Jordan is frontline, cares about what affects her. Zeke is up a level saying, what affects my shop? And above that, Sydney's saying, what affects this organization? Very different perspectives of what the goals are of these individuals. The third point I'm going to toss over to Emily, because she actually developed this side, which I think is really quite interesting. So Emily, do you want to take charge?
Sure. You can hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, so I started using this case a couple of years ago, and I think that it's really interesting because so many of our negotiations role plays are race neutral, and this is race conscious. And I think that actually addressing race and the racial environment of the case actually makes it better and easier for the students to engage with it. And specifically, this is taking place in an African American or Black hair salon where clients are going to get traditional Black hairstyles that let's see, what does it say specifically? Micro braids, banana weaves, coiled flat twists, and dreadlocks. And so race is really front and center. And so when I was preparing to teach the case and trying to understand the roles, I realized that actually I teach and I've always taught in predominantly white settings. And so many students are not going to know much about Black hair salons. And I think that the students are actually better able to understand the dispute if they have just some basic information about them. And so in the teaching note, I share some information specifically, and I would say most importantly, that when people go to get these hairstyles, they're going to be there for 3 to 6 hours. So it's a very long relationship, or a long time that people are actually in the salon. And so at the center of the dispute between Zeke and Jordan is that Jordan, the stylist, sort of acts like a diva. She sort of acts like a star. And so I have had the experience that students don't really find her a very sympathetic character, but once they understand the length of time that clients are spending with her, they really see that that's actually a really good business strategy. And so in the teaching note, I just have some basic information about Black hair salons that can help seed that perspective on Jordan in particular. And then I teach this in an HR class. And so at the conclusion, I talk about appearance policies, which are those formal and informal codes that govern dress and appearance. And these appearance policies are a very active area, a very active sort of contentious area where issues of diversity and inclusion are being worked out currently. And so students really enjoy learning about a contemporary issue and connecting it to things that really matter to them. And so specifically, there's a lot of, historically, a lot of discrimination against Black people who want to wear their hair in natural or Afrocentric styles. And so this allows you to talk a bit about that and other types of appearance policies, such as tattoos and yarmulkes and hijabs, all sorts of things. And it allows people to connect to also talk about the Crown Act, which is a set of legislation which is slowly making its way across the United States. So it gives people a sense of how they can connect to this issue. I have found that in teaching this with undergrads and MBA students, that I always have Black students who come up to me afterwards and are so grateful and happy to have a part of their lived experience discussed and just named in the classroom. I never ask them to talk about their own experiences. I simply set it as the context, but they really value that. So my sense is that it really increases their sense of belonging in the classroom and inclusion in the classroom. And for those students who aren't Black, it increases their racial literacy. It enables them to talk more intelligently about issues of race in the workplace. So in the teaching note, I've really tried to present all of the information that you need if you're not comfortable talking about race generally, but you can feel really equipped to do it well and effectively in the classroom. So thanks to Cindy and Stephen for including me in this.
Yeah, so thank you, Emily. This is a fascinating update. At Penn State, we are actually integrating this into our curriculum in the MBA program starting this upcoming fall, so a little time ahead of us. But I think it is something that adds a lot of nuance, really, for people to understand what's going on. And so thank you, Emily, for continuing to develop this. And again, that's the wisdom of the crowds here, is that folks are stepping in and bringing in some really good ideas. All right. So the fourth point here is just to clarify who are the students that you're dealing with. You've got undergrads, you've got MBA, you've got exec MBA. I've taught all of these people at these different levels with this case. And I would say each of them gets something different out of here. Those of you who have taught at these different levels recognize those first level, those undergrads probably connect most with the employee, the first line worker. And so they get something different. They may want and aspire to be up to that mid-level person, the Zeek role. My exec MBAs, though, they come in here with some perspective and they start to see what is the organization doing. It connects really well with our strategic management classes because they're starting to say, well, what is happening with the organization? What's the future of this organization? And how do we align? So this gives a lot of opportunities for different classes and different cohorts to get different materials out of the class. All right. So quick logistics points here. There are 3 main roles at Jordan, Zeke, and Sydney, depending on the number of people in the class. Of course, role can be added, as I mentioned, but it's not a focal member dispute. Usually we give 30 to 45 minutes to prep. Honestly, in today's world, I'm doing this almost all online. As I think Tracy mentioned, it was a similar kind of experience. I give it to them beforehand. They give them a week or at least a day or 2 to prep this, and I think that's a beneficial piece. And then try to give them 50 to 60 minutes to actually do the negotiation. Again, I think it might be a little bit longer when you start doing this stuff online as well, versus if you're doing this face-to-face. Depending on your class, you may want to allow or even encourage subgroup negotiation. Some people talk about the ideas in terms of shadow negotiation, that kind of a language. Depending on how you do this, you might give them the opportunity, if you hand it out beforehand, to give them some time to say, the formal negotiation starts on Tuesday at 1 p.m. But if you want to talk before, go ahead and do that. What we find oftentimes are that Zeke and Sydney want to chat first to get everything sort of in row and alignment. You may also see, if you add the Terry role in, Jordan and Terry talk beforehand, all again to prepare themselves, and you start to see some coalition formation that way. If you decide to go that direction for an online, I'd encourage you then to perhaps go and do separate Zoom sessions for each of them, as opposed to just putting everybody into breakout rooms. If you put people into breakout rooms, they're likely to just stay in that room. When I'm face-to-face, I would just allow them to go out into the hallway and however you want to manage it, or put them into their breakout rooms or whatever it is in the actual building. In this as well, again, we want to give half the people in the Sydney role the taking charge version, half give the unbiased version. That's a pretty simple management piece. So what do they love about this? What do they really enjoy? The first one is the third-party intervention stuff. How Sydney is primed really affects how she treats the negotiation. It's really clear and salient from that kind of perspective. Does she minimize the role of Zeke, or does she serve to support Zeke's actions? Right? That's the taking charge versus the unbiased. I've seen on several occasions that Sydney has actually fired Zeke. Right? That's a pretty strong perspective, but you have somebody coming in here and saying, I'm taking charge, and wait, Zeke, you're pushing back on me? Well, I'm the boss of you, and so this is inappropriate. And then you actually see them actually push Zeke out of the room. What you may actually have here is, gets to this last point, is where does the emotions come into play? Emily mentioned this idea that there is a lot of, Jordan comes off as unsympathetic at times. There's a lot of emotions that are built into this negotiation. And if it's not addressed, this stuff can negatively spiral pretty quickly in different ways. Again, this could be Zeke could try to step up and say, I'm in charge, and Sydney doesn't like that and then pushes Zeke out. Or in other situations, it just leads to people yelling at each other and having to be sort of pulled out. Again, I want people to be engaged in my negotiations. I think that's fantastic. They're engaged in the class, but these are important things to deal with in a debrief, and students really do want to lean into that. The big piece of this is starting with, for me, I always begin by debriefing Zeke. What was your experience? What did you feel? Right? And they will have very different experiences based on what they see that Sydney did. Did Sydney come in there and just take over the meeting? Did Sydney dictate, or was Sydney inclusive? Did Sydney get Zeke to take charge himself, and so forth? And that makes a big difference here. Just as an aside, I also, if you haven't seen in The Office, there's a clip on Win-Win-Win, where they talk about third-party interventions. And in this way, I always show this clip with this negotiation, because it's all about how do both parties win, plus does the mediator win? And the students really do, I think, connect with that on this piece. This is timely. This is a situation where if you go back and 30 years ago, employment relationships were such that you were within this company, you might have lifetime employment and so forth. Like, it was a very contained space. But in today's world, you're seeing more and more of people being asked to sort of drive business to one's work. You're not just doing your work, but you're doing pre-sales. You're doing something else to grow something within the organization. Or another way of putting this is, you are not, the product is not just the hair work, the hairstyling and so forth that's being done, but you yourself are the product. Again, as Emily mentioned here, you're in this kind of a space where you're building this relationship, you're driving more business to the company, and so forth. And you're, with this Instagram connections and so forth, you're actually advertising. And students really, particularly the younger students, are really interested in this notion because they see themselves as more than just, an automaton within the organization, another cog. They see themselves as having, their own self-worth and their own agency. And this is a good debriefing point that works very well for the undergraduate population. The third is this is an entrepreneurial context. As I mentioned earlier here, this is a really important factor as our students are really starting to say is how do we go from 3 to 100 employees? We talk about the growth trajectory, scaling up. The scaling up on one side is about scaling up the product sales and production, but the other part of scaling up is managing the individuals within the organization. And it's a very different thing to have an organization of 3 than an organization of 100. And so they're thinking through this process. It's a great debriefing point for the entrepreneurial students on how do we do this? How do we manage this? How do we formalize things that were informal before? And what happens when people were, each of these salons had their own sort of actions, but we want to create a very specific unified policy within the entire organization. And that's a great opportunity for them as well. All right. And then, of course, the fourth, which I don't feel is comfortable debriefing, but Emily had the ideas she raised before, is the students really, from her perspective, are connecting with the diversity and inclusion aspects as well. All right. That's my points. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Stephen and Emily. We do have one question from the chat that I see Emily has addressed, but just to share it more globally with people that don't have access to the chat. The question is, do students ever feel uncomfortable being asked to actively play someone of a different race?
Yeah, so I've been responding to some of the chats, but somebody, I think Sally, replied that, then this is true, that sometimes I think there's this presumption that the role plays are white people. And so this actually provides an explicit example where students are asked to imagine the perspective of a Black person. And I think that that's good for them. And Belrose Reagans and Kyle Earhart just published a study in JAP in the last year that looks specifically at an exercise of perspective taking of somebody who's from a different race. And they show that it really helps beliefs around diversity and inclusion. And I find that an empowering idea, but also it might help you frame for yourself and really ground yourself for teaching this ahead of time. But it is not explicit, but it is implicit that all of the people in this role play are Black. So it's not like you have to choose, this is going to be a white person and that's going to be a Black person. All of these people are working in a Black hair salon. And if they're not Black, then they're familiar with Black culture, deeply familiar with Black culture. So you don't have to make choices in that way. So I never think about it. I don't think about who I'm assigning to what role. And I think that's actually a nice way, of sort of setting a different kind of, different set of ground rules or different set of base assumptions that's really beneficial in this case.
An additional point, when we were developing this, I was rolling this out or I was testing it with my exec MBA class, and one of the students, her sister, she's Vietnamese, and her sister, also Vietnamese, actually owned a hair salon. And so we actually got a lot of insight from her on how do we manage this, and we actually had to modify some of the information based on that. But it also allows for another sort of cross-cultural connection in that kind of a spot. So she was very well aware of this. I mean, she perhaps didn't do this specific thing, but she was understood the context and the experience that were involved with that. And I think you have great opportunities that way as well.
Great. We have 2 additional questions. Can you explain the comment about putting groups in their own Zoom session instead of a breakout session to allow for sidebar conversations?
Yeah. Again, my experience with when you have you have a single Zoom session and you have breakout rooms, they're in their breakout rooms and they don't have the ability to have a breakout room from the breakout room itself. So they can't really sidebar nearly as well. By allowing them to say, here's your time, go out to your own link and manage this process. They could start in a main session and say, hey, we just want to pop out for a second and do this. I've actually tried doing this all in one main session. What they had to do was say, please leave and go to the main session. And that becomes a little awkward for them, and they don't know how to handle this, and it feels more exclusionary that way. And so they're less likely, I think, to do that. So that was why I encourage people to run this as your own link. It also allows you to record it in the case of our online classes, our online MBA and so forth. We actually have them recorded and post up so that students can actually observe some of the other negotiations that happen and give feedback on that process. And that actually gives us a lot more value too.
All right, I think, Jamie, I think we're going to move on just because we're limited on time. So I want to make sure that Laura gets to talk about her wonderful multi-party, multi-issue, multicultural negotiation that uses the ethical context of the global emissions scandal that happened several years ago.
Thanks. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me and see me? Awesome, fantastic. So I'll give you just a really quick personal background of this case. So confession, we actually own a Volkswagen, one of our cars. And we both really care about the environment. And I find that we are often not talking about it in business school context that much. And so when this case came up, this is based on the Volkswagen emission scandal that probably you all remember from a few years ago. And that actually, I haven't checked it since I taught this case last in May, but it's still kind of ongoing in a lot of different ways. So it was pretty neat to write and pretty important for me personally. Let's see, all right, there we go. So again, it's based on Volkswagen, and that it's really open in the case. I'm not trying to hide it at all that it's based on Volkswagen, but I quickly shift to calling it Motorworks just because I do take some liberties with some of the data, and particularly the setup of the conversation, because this is a hypothetical meeting between Germany, which is the home country of the headquarters of Motorworks, Canada, Australia, and there are references to the US and South Korea in the case as well. That didn't actually happen. I don't think it would ever happen, probably in real life, but really makes a nice setup for the case itself. So the students understand, a lot of them actually have a lot of personal knowledge or even experience with the scandal. Particularly my European students tend to get pretty excited about this. So it does pretty well. And I think the data in a sense speak for themselves, and a lot of this is based on real data. So the numbers are real. I did take some liberties of trying to make everything in the same units and kind of valuing some of the open court cases that were a little bit ambiguous, but you see it's kind of shocking in how countries have been compensated or not based on the number of affected cars. And really it's incredibly inequitable around the world. And so some people anchor on the US. There are a couple different anchor points provided in the information given on South Korea about vouchers and non-vouchers and things like this that make it really interesting. Just sort of straight up reading the information, you think that there's no chance for a ZOPA. There's actually a pretty good chance, but you do have to get kind of creative in how you're looking at financial versus non-financial, which is another key point of the exercise. There's no need to do any additional research. It is interesting when students bring in prior knowledge, but there's absolutely no need, and you don't need to know that much about cars at all. It's all explained in the case that you need to know about emissions and what that means. And there are three basic issues, and the case gives you kind of an agreement sheet so you can compile those and share those across teams. One is just the compensation, both for consumers and environmental damage. Most people tend to think that that means financial, but it doesn't always have to be. That's always a huge lesson that I point out, even from the first case that I do in class of what is value. It's not always just money. And then the two, I think, more interesting issues, because there's a lot of room to figure out what to do here, are the national responses. So what does each country do, if anything, to sort of reestablish a sense of justice and trust across consumers, across environmental groups, kind of everything. There's some opportunities for positive press or not. That are really big value adds that can go sort of under the radar if you're not paying attention. And then is there anything to prevent this from happening again? So any kind of long-term prevention, international committees or oversight boards or things like this that can be difficult for students to talk about, but really add a lot of value if they can figure out how to make this work. There's also some things in the cases that give, you can imagine without my even telling you anything, that there are some big kind of surface level power differences between Germany and Canada and Australia, just in size and headquarters and market power and laws and et cetera. Canada often gets pretty upset because their laws are really similar to the US and they've been treated absolutely nothing like the US in this case. Australia has some benefit. They secretly are actually hosting the UN climate summit in the following year that the other countries don't quite know. And so there's some opportunities to really create a lot of additional value and think outside the box. That's nice when students think of it and is a good learning opportunity for when they don't. So a lot of kind of typical key learning points about conflict and different parties, interest rights power framework, if you use that. I think for me, one of the most interesting lessons, the first time I ran this was quite experimental, is the value of the shadow negotiations and the caucusing. So the way I set it up, and I'll tell you a little bit more on the next slide, Motorworks actually has a lot of control in how they structure the situation, which is pretty unique. They tend to use that. They often don't use it in the right way. But again, it provides a lot of interesting lessons and things like that. The countries themselves, I think, learn how to use coalitions and talk in the hallways and et cetera. And I'll tell you how I set it up both in person and in Zoom on that too. And then one really interesting thing, again, back to this point of fairness and equity and justice and financial, non-financial, and et cetera, is once I've shown all the agreements, you actually get, I've tended to get some pretty interesting reactions of groups that used to think things were fine that now suddenly get really angry and realize that they haven't gotten a similar agreement to some other groups and get kind of upset about that. Actually, a student pointed out to me, and so I shared it with my students last time, they loved it. There's an episode of Dirty Money, if you know this show, specifically about this case that's pretty interesting and is a nice kind of tag on to the end, particularly for the students who really care about it. They want to know what's happened and the current state of events. So the logistics, it's a couple of different parts. The first part are shadow negotiations and kind of caucusing. So the Motorwork representatives, and I'd really encourage you to double these up if you have at all the number of students to be able to do that. It helps Motorworks. It's just a really good idea, both for power dynamics. They can also then decide, you know, is one of them good cop, bad cop? Are they doing some other sort of tactic? How will they run that? They actually meet all together first to debate how each team wants to set up part two. So the two basic options, many Motorworks say we'd like to meet with each country sequentially, so we can divide and conquer in a way, particularly when you see the differences in what countries are asking and demanding and things like this. Others say we'd actually like to meet maybe with every country together and then we'll meet sequentially. Both have really different implications for how the process goes. But a lot of Motorworks forget that while they're doing that, actually the countries can also meet on their own. And when in person I did this, I actually had a huge classroom and I print on kind of the old school print on different colored paper. You can have different colored name tags based on role. And I was kind of nervous, you know, if I send 80% of the class to a different large room and I'm not there, what will they do? Will it just be chaos? And actually when I kind of peeked in on them, it was amazing to see they were really taking this seriously. Usually the teams would meet, the three countries, they would split up. Germany's would all want to meet together. Australia's would all want to meet together. They would sometimes come back. They would break off into subgroups. And it really gave, I think, the country representatives a lot of power and time to build really strong coalitions, particularly if their Motorworks decided to split them up. And the space between all of these meetings in the hallways were fantastic to watch, because that's when teams would compare and say, oh, I'm feeling pretty good about what Motorworks has said to me, and then realize that another team had actually gotten something very different. And then suddenly that country would go back and Motorworks would be totally surprised. What happened? What happened? We thought we were on a good, in a good spot. And they realized that all of this information was kind of going around. Really amazing to watch. I was pretty nervous when I ran this on Zoom, but you can actually set up different breakout rooms and it worked pretty well. It's even better now that Zoom has updated and they can actually choose which breakout room to go to. So you can just label them different things and it should be fairly seamless. I actually didn't have any issue with it. And I was nervous about, so many people in a breakout room, this kind of thing. And it tended to work pretty well, actually. And in the middle is when you have all these meetings. Again, the simultaneous sequential is a really key learning point for them afterwards. And also, how did they use that time when they weren't in a meeting? Did they use it productively? How did they find that shaped things is really kind of fascinating. Debrief, I like to talk a lot. I'm also gonna get it shutting up when I need to. So it's pretty flexible with that. I usually let students go back in their original teams and kind of figure out amongst themselves and then come back as a full class. You could also do it that you have all the Motorworks go talk, all the Germanys go talk. So it's kind of flexible in how you want to organize that debrief and also how much time you want to give with that. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. So I'll actually just stop there and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. It's usually a really interesting case to run. I was actually really surprised at how much the students cared about it. I was ready to sort of go in my pro-environmental kick, and they actually were already there, which I guess shows I'm out of date, and they're way ahead of me, when it was awesome to see, because they focused a lot immediately on, hey, Motorworks, you're evil, you've done all these things, what's going on? I think they came out pretty strong, often Germany really strong. And it was really interesting to see. You could also add in conversations about the value of an apology and what is a real apology. Does it need to have action, and things that would be really, I think, kind of captivating too. So I'll stop sharing there. Don't know if there are any questions. Try to be short.
There aren't any questions at this time.
Awesome. I'm going to take it that I was so clear that there are no questions. Or you're just ready to go have lunch or dinner or wine or whatever. Thanks.
It looks like Colleen did have a quick question about whether this case is for grad students, I guess, versus undergrads.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can say, yes, it's for everybody. I actually tested it out with undergrads first and used it later with graduate students and had really similar effects. I will say, rather than student level, so the undergrads, graduate students, same level of impasse, you're probably going to get 1 or 2 teams per class that don't reach an agreement. Some later who regret it, which is why the fairness equity conversation after they've seen everybody is really interesting. I didn't find much difference at all. I will say the bigger difference that I found was actually between, and I didn't have any, to be fair, I didn't have any, I'm in Canada, did not have any Australian students, but my European students knew a lot, cared a lot, and I think really drove a lot of the conversation. But that was the biggest difference. And I think, you know, I had maybe 1 or 2 Europeans for each team that really played a nice role, particularly in the debrief, where they talked about how they had seen it in their country, or their own cars even were affected, and things like that.
Thank you, Laura. All right, Nat, last but not least, I would like to turn it over to Maurice Schweitzer, who is going to do a very interesting exercise about a multi-party team-based exercise with a lot of dynamics in it. All right, Maurice, are you there? And let's make sure you can share screens. Jamie, can you make sure that Maurice has co-host privileges?
Well, thanks for waiting. Okay, great. Okay. Great. Well, thanks for sticking around. This is a 6-party exercise with 2 teams of 3. And I'll basically sort of set it up sort of very simply. It's in the context of a renegotiation. It's between a shipbuilder who's trying to sell these engines. They make engines for large ships, and a distributor, a transportation company that's seen a downturn in demand and needs to renegotiate the contract. There's a renegotiation clause in the contract, so they can renegotiate it. So they're basically in the shadow of a prior agreement, they're renegotiating the terms to buy fewer engines. And there are a number of different issues. It's a multi-issue negotiation. The 6 parties in this negotiation come from 2 different sides. So it's teams of 3. So this would be a case to complete at the end of a negotiation course. And the payoffs I purposely made to be diverse. So some of the individuals are maximizing the amount of profits that they make. Some have points. And so by the end of a semester, if your courses are anything like mine, sometimes students devolve into, well, I get 2 points or I get 10,000 in profit, trying to compare their payoffs. I tell them not to do that. In this case, the trade-offs there, I mean, when they devolve into that, they hit a dead end and they've got to go back to focusing on the key issues because they realize that their payoffs aren't compatible at all. So it works quite nicely in that way, that is, we can compare people within a role, but across roles, they're really kind of on their own. and then there are also contingent payoffs. So here, there's a key piece of information about a technology that the manufacturer has been developing, and they'd like to keep the technology development secret. And so there's a tension between trying to share versus conceal information, or gather versus conceal information. And there are contingent payoffs that make this a really important issue in the case. So let me just sort of quickly talk about this, like the key lessons here. Often we think about teams, we throw students into teams, but one thing that I think teams lack that I think is really quite important is hierarchy. So out when they leave our sort of gated communities, they'll end up in a team with hierarchy, and navigating that hierarchy, if you're the top or bottom of it, turns out to be quite important. So these teams have a lead role that could cut out subordinates, and there's a within team dynamic they have to navigate. We also think about the credibility and trust, where people want to conceal information. Maybe they conceal it between teams, but not within teams. They've got to build credibility. And then coordinating these teams becomes really quite important. So navigating the team dynamic makes this case, I think, sort of a rich exercise for the end of a semester. I already mentioned this is a renegotiation. So in the shadow of a prior deal, how do we think about the negotiation? And then for some of this like key issue about the technology, this issue about taking issues off the table, can we do that at the beginning sort of very clearly, or is this an issue that keeps dragging through the whole arc of the negotiation? And I find that it happens about half and half, where sometimes teams effectively say, look, I can't reveal this trade secret. And other teams, it becomes a thorn in the side and harms their credibility as they continue through the entire negotiation. This case, it's relatively complicated. So I give about 60 minutes for the teams to prepare. And I've run this both online, sort of meeting, say via Zoom. So they meet about 60 minutes as their team, sharing information. They need to learn information from each other on the team in order to flesh out their payoffs, prepare a strategy, figure out how they're going to speak with one voice or multiple voices through that negotiation. And then I give them about 80 minutes between teams. So the teams of 3 meeting and sometimes caucusing during that negotiation. But that 6-person, all 6 parties together ends up being a very rich conversation. So this is the way I finish off. I would finish off my semester. That is with a team-based, multi-party, pretty rich experience. And I find that it's incredibly generative for thinking about teams, renegotiation, trust, and credibility. I don't know. I know that we're pressing up against time, so I'm happy to entertain questions if you have any, but I didn't want to go long.
So there is one question, Maurice. It says, do you use this across 2 classes, 80-minute classes, or do you have longer class periods?
Yeah, so great question. Typically, it's spread across multiple classes. So I typically teach 80-minute classes. I would rather teach 3-hour classes. In an 80-minute class, basically, I would start the exercise in one class. And in that class, it would just be the teams of 3. And those team meetings can go on. And actually, what's nice is at the end of class, some teams will stay longer, or they'll arrange another time outside of class to meet. So you could kick the team meeting outside of class also. But I typically do it and give them at least an hour as a team. But I could even, some teams will want to go longer. And then the second class, I would bring them back. And then in that class, as a group of 6, if you have breakout rooms, or they could sort of, find spaces, as a group of 6, they would take the entire 80-minute class to negotiate. It's a fairly involved negotiation. It's the kind of negotiation, I guess, like Viking or some others. Like, if students show up unprepared, it's going to be tough. But at least with the team meeting, they'll be forced to sort of really jump into it and get up to speed.
Great. We have another question from Robert. How does the case lend itself to instances where one person for a team doesn't show up for class?
Yeah, that's a perennial problem. So there's so there's a team lead on each team. Those team leads are extremely important. They're supporting roles, and you can run the case without one of the supporting roles. But what I would suggest is, if you don't have a perfectly even number of participants, to double up the team lead roles. The other option is, if somebody doesn't show up, you have one of the team members take on that, sort of play a second role. I've done that and it works. Attendance, I think of negotiations as, sometimes sort of fragile. We need attendance. I mean, the other option is to double up all of the roles. So instead of a 6-person negotiation, you could have a 12-person negotiation, or you have one group that does a 12-person negotiation. And that's often what will end up happening. Is in my classroom, I'll have one large team that maybe has, eight people instead of the 6 in the rest of the teams.
Great, thank you so much. We have one last question from chat. From Cindy. How do the students deal with the hierarchy? Do some students form coalitions against the powerful players, for example?
Yeah, in this case, so we don't end up having, we don't see coalitions forming. So it's hierarchy within a team. So it's a 3-person team and there's one lead. That person who's in charge, they're incentivized to include the whole team, but they know that they could cut out their team members. What I like about this is, I think it's quite realistic. That is, often we'll bring along our lead engineer. We can override them, or we could override the CFO, but it's probably unwise, and we really want to include their counsel. And I think what's quite interesting in this dynamic, sometimes you see the leaders who explicitly say, hey, you know what, Cindy, I could cut you out, just so you know. And that puts people on their back heels. They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be cut out. What's happening? Whereas in other groups, it never comes up. And so these other players, like, it never occurred to them that they could be cut out of the deal. And I sort of talk about, how do you lead a negotiation team where you're making the ultimate decision, but you'd like your team to all be on the same page, all be on board. You need to gather information from them. You need their trust. And if you present a unified front, it's much more effective. Where, it could be that, the engineer that, wants more time or wants more funding to be allocated to research may have incentives that are at variance with what the leader really wants every step of the way. And so there's a coordination issue that I think is really quite fun and interesting. But it really isn't about coalitions. It's really more about managing a team.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for talking about ocean-wide shipping. We are at the end of our time for this workshop. Thank you so much for everyone that has been able to join us for our session today. I just want to go ahead and thank our content providers and specialists that came to speak with us today. Thank you, Cindy, for organizing us and presenting. Tracy, Jeffrey, Emily, Stephen, Raya, Laura, and Maurice. If you would like to follow up, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to follow up with these distinguished guests and professors at the end of our session. Right now, I'm going to transition us to our social. So those that would like to stay, catch up, I know it's been a weird year and continuance of a year meeting virtually, but we're going to try to have an early virtual happy hour social and mingle. So please make sure if you're interested in staying and chatting and catching up, please do so now. And we'll give about 2 minutes to transition. For those that want to stay, please stay. And if you have to leave, thank you so much for joining us. We will have more sessions throughout this year. Our next session coming up is a methods workshop. And Sebastian, I believe the date is in March for the methods workshop.
I think it's February, but maybe you're correct on March. Let me check.
Yes, February 16th,
Maybe
10
Lucas has a better
a.m.
call.
to 1 p.m. Eastern time is our next session for the Conflict Management Division. If you want to learn about methods, please join us there. We will be sending a reminder email for you and those that are interested to register and sign up. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes for everyone to transition, and we will begin our social. Oh, for those that want to register, Lucas just provided the registration link for the methods workshop in the chat. So please make sure if you're interested that you sign up. Thank you so much, Lucas, for doing that.
I'm gonna go get more coffee. Right back.
So someone asked, how do you access the recording of the session? So I have recorded the session and I will provide the link to DRRC and they will be hosting it or uploading it to their website. Once the link is ready to be uploaded, then we will send out an email with that particular link so you can access the recording. And thank you for that reminder so I can stop the recording for our social.